In early 2026, a war kicked off that would completely redraw the map of the Middle East. So in this explainer, we're going to break down how it all started, how it escalated so quickly, and the terrifying questions it leaves for the future. Mark this date on your calendar, February 28th, 2026. This is the day the decades-long shadow war between the United States, Israel, and Iran finally, and I mean finally, exploded into open, direct, and total conflict. So, the opening phase of the war was a U.S.-Israeli campaign they codenamed Operation Epic Fury. And let me tell you, it was designed from the ground up for maximum shock and awe. Now, the key term you gotta focus on here is maximalist. This wasn't some proportional response or a slap on the wrist. No, this was an all-in strategy. We're talking about the complete and total teardown of Iran's ability to wage war, targeting literally everything from its ships and missiles all the way up to its supreme leadership. And the results? Well, in just the first 5 days, they were absolutely staggering. The coalition killed Supreme Leader Khamenei in a decapitation strike. They took out former President Ahmadinejad and over 40 senior commanders of the powerful IRGC. They completely annihilated the Iranian Navy in the Gulf of Oman, and they conducted over 1,700 strikes. The scale was just unprecedented. So the big question, right? How did we get here? A conflict of this magnitude doesn't just happen overnight. To really get the logic of this war, we have to rewind the clock a bit. We've got to look at the chain reaction of diplomatic failures and broken deterrents that made this whole thing feel pretty much inevitable. This timeline, it shows you a relentless 2-year cycle of escalation. Every single step just pushed both sides further and further away from peace. It all started with Iran's first ever direct missile attack on Israel in 2024. The response? High-profile assassinations of Iran's proxy leaders. By mid-2025, the shadow war was basically over. The US and Israel were striking Iranian nuclear sites directly. And then the economic hammer fell. A snapback of UN sanctions just crippled Iran's economy, which led to massive unrest inside the country and, of course, brutal crackdowns by the state. And the economic pressure was just immense. I mean, get this, by December 2025, it took 1.42 million Iranian rials to equal a single US dollar. That level of hyperinflation basically lit a domestic tinderbox. So, facing these huge anti-regime protests, Ayatollah Khamenei gave the order for lethal force. And that brutal crackdown, it signaled to the US and its allies that the regime felt it was facing an existential threat from within. And that changed the entire game. With a massive US military buildup happening in the region, both sides agreed to one final, desperate shot at diplomacy in Geneva. And this was just weeks before the war began. And if you want to know why the talks failed, you really just have to look at the demands. They were completely irreconcilable. The US side wanted the complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Iran flat out refused, insisting on keeping their infrastructure. The US wanted to talk about missiles and regional proxies. Iran insisted on keeping the focus strictly on the nuclear program. The gap was it was unbridgeable. There was no deal to be made. So, with the failure of diplomacy, it wasn't just the region that was plunged into crisis. It was the entire world. Now, despite the coalition's overwhelming initial assault, Iran's ability to strike back proved to be both deadly and widespread. A drone strike killed 6 American reservists in Kuwait. The whole idea of the UAE as a regional safe haven was shattered by over 1,000 strikes. Up north, Hezbollah opened a second front against Israel. And tragically, the human cost was just immense on all sides, like a coalition strike on a school in Mina Baran that killed 148 civilians. And the economic shock? It was felt globally, almost instantly. With the Strait of Hormuz, which is basically the world's oil artery, effectively closed for business, the price of Brent crude oil surged, threatening to kick off another round of global inflation. At an emergency UN Security Council session, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he really captured the global fear. He said the war risked an uncontrollable chain of events. But the Council, just like the talks in Geneva, was completely deadlocked. You know, the war didn't just reshape the Middle East. It triggered a pretty profound institutional shift right back home in the US government itself. In a move that was just dripping with symbolism, the administration officially renamed the Department of Defense back to its original, pre-1947 name, the Department of War. And according to the new Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, this wasn't just about changing the sign on the building. He said it was about fundamentally reorienting the entire agency away from a defensive posture and toward, in his words, restoring lethality and offensive dominance. So all of this, the military strikes, the economic shocks, the political changes, it leaves us all staring into an unwritten and, frankly, a very perilous future. And that brings us to the end game, the coalition's incredibly high-stakes gamble. The strategy had three parts. First, decapitate the leadership. Check. Second, degrade the military. Check. But that third step, that was the real roll of the dice. Incite a domestic uprising to achieve a total collapse of the regime. But that strategy raises a terrifying question, right? Does this external attack cause the regime to circle the wagons and consolidate its power, rallying the population? Or does it actually shatter the state, plunging a heavily armed nation of millions into a chaotic, bloody civil war? And what about the rest of the world? With the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely, how long before the pressure to secure global energy supplies forces a decision to escalate even further, maybe into a devastating ground invasion? One thing is for sure, the old order in the Middle East is gone, and that leaves a massive power vacuum. So the final, critical question we're left with is this: who or what is going to rise from the ashes to shape the future?